Module 4 in the Finance 311 course is really about pulling together all of the tools and cash flow modeling, time value of money information, weighted average cost of capital, pulling all of that together in the context of doing valuations and capital budgeting and making capital budgeting decisions. I have already provided you a video on how to calculate the 3 primary metrics used for capital budgeting decisions. That would be net present value, internal rate of return, and payback period for an example project, the one that I did in class. And now I really just want to discuss with you some of the key sort of concepts about how companies use that. I apologize, there's not a whole lot from a PowerPoint standpoint to go through here, but I thought that having a little bit of a placeholder would at least keep me on track. So the main things I want to cover and want to make sure that you guys get out of this, aside from knowing how to calculate those metrics, are listed as learning objectives. First one, explain the business issue being addressed by capital budgeting. In a nutshell, the business issue is this. Companies or individuals, whomever, people are faced all of the time with this issue of I have a business opportunity. It's going to require me to put a certain amount of money in at the beginning, and hopefully over time I will take a certain amount of money out at the end. And the question is, should I do the investment? Should I take advantage of the business opportunity? Is it worth it to me to do that? And so what capital budgeting tries to do is to provide you guidance, some sort of a set of analysis and decision rules that would allow you to decide which projects you should consider and which ones you shouldn't. Now, this really comes in 2 different flavors, if you will. The first flavor of this business issue is simply the question of, is it a good project or not? And so imagine that I've got 5 projects to choose from. I've got an unlimited amount of money, and assuming that I want to, I would pursue as many of those 5 projects as I could afford to. And again, I have unlimited money, so that's all of them. But that I determine are worth pursuing. And so in that case, this is just a threshold issue. What is the amount, or what is the decision rule that says do the project or don't do the project? The second scenario that you might have here is a little bit different. Imagine that we have a limited amount of money, and so we might only be able to afford to do 1 or 2 projects. And it's not enough to say which projects we should do or not. We have to rank them from what we consider to be the best projects to not as good of projects, so that we have some way of picking the ones that we can afford to do. So that is a scenario that we call capital rationing. Generally speaking, capital budgeting is done under the assumption that money is infinite. It's just a question of the amount that it costs to raise it. But quite frankly, the way that most capital budgeting is done, the entire process of doing it assumes certain things about how you raise your money. And so most of the time we really are working in some sort of a capital constrained environment in the real world. Anyway, so the issues being addressed in a nutshell become, is it a good project? And number 1, and assuming that it is a good project, if there are multiple good projects, which ones are better than others? How would I rank them if I had to pick one above the others, and that was the only one I could afford to do? The gold standard, and so looking at our second learning objective here, the gold standard for capital budgeting is and always has been the net present value, or NPV investment rule. The net present value calculation, in a nutshell, basically calculates how much additional value a project would contribute once it pays off its cost of capital. And so if we go back to kind of at the beginning of the course our discussion that one of the primary roles of managers is to make decisions that improve the value of the firm, we would want to take on projects that improve the value of the firm. And therefore, NPV, net present value, is a measure directly of the kinds of things that a manager should care about, that they're actually improving the dollar value of the firm. The NPV rule will work, obviously, with multiple projects. You could identify projects that are adding value or not, and the way that you determine that is simply if the net present value is greater than 0, then you're adding value, and if it's less than 0 or equal to 0, you're either not adding value or you're actually destroying value. The amount you're spending on your project is more than what the project itself is worth, and so you would be destroying value. And so the rule is simply that we accept positive NPV projects. When you have multiple projects, you could rank them in terms of the ones that provide the most value. So how much value above 0 does each project provide? And so that would be one simple way of doing things. I take the projects, assuming that I can afford to do it, I take the one that generates the most value, and then the one that generates the next most, and so on and so on. There's a complexity to this, and the complexity basically comes from the fact that not all of our projects are of equal size, and not all of our projects require the same amount of money up front in order to execute on them. And so, for example, it is possible that there is a choice between either doing one project because you don't have enough money to do more than one that generates a certain amount, or doing two projects that each of them generate less of an amount, but combined they generate more than the first project, and you can afford to do those two projects instead of doing the first project. So sometimes you have this sort of mixing and matching issue when you try to rank projects. Again, they would all have to be good projects. They would all have to have positive NPV before you would even consider it. But it's not entirely clear how to go through that process. Ultimately, I guess the answer would be that we want to take the combination that results in the highest total NPV. And that can sometimes be tricky. Now, because number one, the NPV doesn't necessarily scale things by the dollar value of the investment, and number two, it does require you to actually calculate out a specific weighted average cost of capital. There are people who, instead of using that gold standard, prefer something else called the internal rate of return. The internal rate of return, as you saw in the other video, is simply a calculation of what the percentage return on the capital you invest is. And so you would be able to go through for any project and basically solve for think of it as the discount rate or the rate of return to the investors. Both of those are synonymous, obviously, as we discussed before, but what the rate of return would be for the money invested on a particular project. And obviously what you want is a project, the decision rule on it would be that it would be a project that has a rate of return higher than your weighted average cost of capital. Now that seems like a little bit of a cheat because we said you don't need the cost of capital to calculate IRR, and you don't, but you do need it to make the decision. It's not as much of a cheat as you might think because I don't necessarily need to know exactly what my weighted average cost of capital is. I just have to have a general sense of where that level is and about when I would cut off and basically say I just can't take a project that returns less than this. And so a lot of times that's a nice rule for companies that recognize that that maybe their projects are very different in nature, and some of them have higher risk or lower risk and that sort of thing. They shouldn't really be using exactly the same cost of capital on them. And so this gives them a way of looking at them and just understanding that for this project that's this much more risky, there's this much more return. Do we feel like it's worth it or not? And so a lot of times companies use that. Additionally, quite frankly, there are more and more companies using that alongside of NPV so that they get sort of the two of them together. The challenge with IRR, this was discussed a little bit in the prior video, the video on calculating it. One of the challenges to IRR is that there are scenarios when it provides more than one result. In particular, if you have any change in direction, so let's say we start out with the negative cash flows that at the beginning of a project that you usually have to invest to get things started. And from there, maybe it stays negative for a little while and then it starts to turn positive. Well, as long as it goes from negative to positive and doesn't turn back to negative, there's only one possible internal rate of return that you can solve for. If it flips back from positive to then being negative and then maybe going positive again, each time that it flips back and forth creates another possible solution to the internal rate of return calculation. And so now you're faced with trying to figure out which of them is correct. And technically, mathematically, they're both correct. And so that creates an ambiguity. And so sometimes when that happens, you just fall back on NPV and say, maybe we shouldn't use the IRR. Alternatively, there may be one that's more obviously correct than the other. So one may give you a result that's sort of in that 10 to 20% range, and the other may give you 150% or minus 200% or some range that realistically none of us thinks is a valid result. And so in those situations, we would just take the one that we think is in the realistic range. Now, you can't do that when one's in 10 to 20 and the other's at, say, 22, because they're both pretty close to a valid number. So, again, you have this problem. The other issue with IRR, aside from just that calculation issue, is that the IRR does not take into consideration the size of your project. And so, for example, we might have one project that has a fantastic internal rate of return. It's 25%, everything else is at 15, let's just say, and it's at 25. But we're only able to raise $100 from that. So we put in, $50 and raise $100. And we can only do one of those. Well, that's great, except for that's not, a whole lot of money. I might have another one, another project that, I put in $1 million and I raised 22% instead of 25. And it's 22% on $1 million, which is a lot more value. And yet IRR would say, oh, we like the $100 project better than the $1 million project. So as with anything else, you can't just blindly follow the rule. You need to take into consideration value. Okay, so again, one of the problems with IRR is that it can sometimes lead you to pick a project that doesn't necessarily provide the most value to the company. It just provides the most return on value to the company. And so in that case, NPV would give you the right answer, but IRR might not. The last rule that we'll evaluate is the payback period rule. Again, we calculated that in another video. And the payback period rule is basically calculating how many months or how many years it takes to pay back the original investment. And so it's quite literally that you just keep taking the instances where you have positive cash flows and paying them back against the negative cash flows that you've been accumulating over the project until you get to the point of a break even, where the positive cash flows are enough to completely pay off the investment but no more. And you sort of mark that date or that month and you say, oh, it took this long in order for us to pay back the project. And so that's actually a pretty simple thing for somebody to conceptualize and figure out on a napkin. It's a little harder to do in Excel, but it's actually one of the oldest decision rules used, and part of the reason is because it was easy to calculate without a computer. Now, Not a bad rule, and in general, when we have projects that are sort of similar size and all that sort of stuff, likely to give you similar results to the other two rules. Basically, the way that you would use this one in terms of an objective criteria, the payback period, is you would say, we only want to look at projects that pay back their original investment in, say, 3 years or less. And so if your project pays back in 3 years or less, you're good. If it takes longer than 3 years, don't do the project. And similarly, you could rank projects in terms of how fast they pay back. Okay. The big problem with the payback period rule is that it does not consider or treat differently two projects that maybe have different cash flows after the date that the payback is done. So imagine that I have two projects, and one of those, they both pay back everything in, say, 2 years. And one of those, at the end of the 2 years, it never makes another penny. And the other one, at the end of the 2 years, makes $1 billion. The payback rule would say those are both identical. It really doesn't matter. The payback rule also doesn't really account for time value of money at all. So say you have two projects that both require $1 million investment, and one of them pays $900,000 of that investment back to you in the very first month, but it takes it another, 23 months to pay back the remaining $100,000. The other project pays you back $100,000 in the first month, and then doesn't pay you the other $900,000 until right at your month 24. So in one of them you get most of your money up front, and the other one you have to wait for most of your money. But you both projects pay off completely. They're at break even in month 24. Payback period would say those two are exactly identical, that you shouldn't prefer one over the other. So there are things that we know about time value of money that don't make sense with the payback period rule. Again, it's just used because of its simplicity. So, where do we go from here? Well, the big challenge generally for capital budgeting is not the sort of simple situation where I've got one project and I'm just trying to figure out whether it's a good project. It generally happens when I have multiple projects and I'm just trying to figure out what to do. So as we talked about before, one of those scenarios would be the unlimited capital versus capital rationing. If I have unlimited capital, I would take all of the projects that have a positive NPV, all of the projects that have an internal rate of return greater than my weighted average cost of capital, and all of the projects that pay back within the maximum payback time that's okay for me. And assuming I've set up the criteria similarly for those, they should give me pretty much all the same list of projects. Okay? But if there's capital rationing and I have to rank projects, they will rank them differently. There is nothing that says that the project that gives you the highest NPV will also be the project that gives you the highest IRR. And there's clearly nothing that says that the project that gives you the fastest payback will be either of those. And so now you're faced with the situation of I've got three different metrics, and I've got to somehow rank things. And so how do I rank them if I have a limited amount of money? And generally speaking, when that happens, we give preference first to the net present value because we know that it is the gold standard. And if we find two projects that basically tie on net present value, then we might go to an internal rate of return or a payback period rule to break the tie. The other situation might be that you have multiple projects that are maybe dependent. So when they're independent, which is the simple case we just talked about, I can just pick the best ones. But when they're dependent, I might find that if I pick one, I have to pick another one. And so now I have to evaluate the package of those two against everything else instead of evaluating them independently. And that may change my ranking. Also, they could be mutually exclusive, and so doing one project means I can't do another one. And so, again, I can't just pick an unlimited note. I can't just pick all the good ones, because picking one of them eliminates me from picking another one. Some examples that are often used for that might be a project that says, I'm either going to sell and replace a piece of equipment or I'm going to repair it. Well, you can't do both. You either repair it or you sell it and replace it with something new. So you have to pick between those two. And again, in that situation, generally speaking, what you have to do is look at the value for the project, the one that generates the best value. Another situation that sometimes happens has to do with whether a project can be scaled. Being scaled means I might evaluate, let's just say, a project to make 100 units of something. But I know that if it works, if it's a good project and it makes sense to do it, that I could make 100,000 of them instead of 100. So that project scales. And potentially it scales in such a way that the NPV goes up by 1,000 if I change the volume by 1,000. And so those would be examples of scaled projects. And scaled projects, it's hard to know exactly what the net present value is because I don't know how many units I'm going to produce. Whereas there are other projects where you can only do one size project. And so somebody says, you can build a plant that's this size, and that's all you can build because if that's all that'll fit on the land that we have, period. So you can build a plant this size, it makes that much. That's a much easier sort of thing to handle in NPV. But if they said, well, you can build it that size or twice that size or 4 times that size, clearly each of those choices is going to give you a different magnitude of NPV. And so what do you do? The last situation is one we've already addressed. What happens if your project has a single negative cash flow up the front versus that it alternates between positive and negative over its life? Not a problem for NPV. It is a problem for IRR. It's also a problem for payback period because, think of it this way. You calculated how long it took to pay back the first set of negative cash flows, but maybe 6 months after that, now you have to make another investment. Well, do you go pick that up and now have to pay it back? And so that's sometimes confusing what to do with that. And so at the end of the day, we have these 3 decision rules or 3 metrics, and we have the decision rules around them. And then we have the real world, and the real world's a little bit more messy than the world that we theoretically develop these in. And so you have to be a bit more flexible. Generally speaking, good business savvy companies, their solution to kind of this complexity, if you will, around all these different metrics and rules and issues is that they'll calculate all 3 numbers and maybe some others. There are some others that are more company specific, but they'll calculate multiple metrics for projects and they'll rank them along the lines of all of those metrics. And guess what? Many times the best project will still be the top project in all those metrics, and it'll be very obvious what the top projects are. And maybe you only do those. It's only in certain situations where you might have conflicts. When you have those conflicts, there's 2 different ways of thinking about it. One is you can talk through what your priorities are as management and decide what to do. But if you had to have a firm rule when you have those conflicts, finance always recommends that you revert back to the net present value rule, because it is the one rule that speaks directly to the amount of dollars that you'll be adding to the bottom line by doing the project. So I know that's a lot to cover. There wasn't a lot of visual aid in this other than for me to make sure that I cover everything. But basically, that's what's going on with this. Thank you guys. Bye.